had 2 week paychecks from McDonald's, only $500. Many of my coworkers make even less. I'm gonna show you something else. This is the receipt for my son's childcare, which was $100 a week. I also have to pay heat and water, which is $300. On top of that, I have to pay $500 for rent. I can't pay my bills and support my son off the poverty wages that I make, even after 5 years worked at McDonald's.
My name is Sasha Williams, single mom, 2 little ones. DC General was the family shelter now. I was actually born here, February 18th, 1985. You know, being homeless, getting housed, and going back to being homeless, that shouldn't happen.
I am disabled. I have a genetic connective tissue disorder called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Medicaid and Medicare reduce other costs. Without those programs, I would end up in the hospital a lot more. If these programs are cut, I don't even know if I'll be alive. And that scares the crap out of me. And it also makes me really, really angry.
We made 30 cents an hour, and that's not enough for me to give my kid, a shot at the American dream.
My husband and I both work full-time jobs. With working 40 hours a week, we still do not make enough money to be able to support our family. The saying is the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and that's exactly what is happening. It gets to a point of where, you just don't, you throw in the towel because you just don't know what to do to fix the problem.
Good evening, everyone. And let me thank all of you for being with us here in the nation's capital. We have an overflow crowd, and let me thank the many, many people all over the country who are watching this town meeting via the internet. Tonight, we are going to ask some questions and have a discussion with some of the most knowledgeable people in this country on issues that are very, very rarely, if ever, discussed in the corporate media. Tonight, we're going to take a hard look at why over the last 40 years, the middle class of this country has declined while oligarchy is on the rise. And why during those 40 years, over $13 trillion in wealth has been transferred from the bottom 99% to the top 1%. Tonight, we're going to talk about income and wealth inequality and what it means morally and economically when 3 people in this country own more wealth than the bottom half of America. When the top 1%, when the top 1/10 of 1% now owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. We're going to talk about our national priorities, when in recent years we have seen an incredible growth in the number of billionaires, while 40 million Americans in our country continue to live in poverty, and we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth. Tonight, we're going to talk about what it means for the working class of this country when over 50,000 factories have been shut down since 2001 and millions of workers have lost decent paying jobs. We'll discuss what it means when trade union representation in the private sector has declined from about 30% in the late 1950s to less than 7% today. But it's not just economics that we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to ask what it means to American democracy when, as a result of this disastrous Supreme Court decision on Citizens United, we have a handful of billionaires like the Koch brothers who are prepared to spend $400 million in the midterm elections to elect candidates who represent the wealthy and the powerful. And we're going to discuss why it is that 4 years ago, almost 2/3 of the American people chose not to vote. We're going to discuss why it is that the United States of America the wealthiest country in the history of the world, is the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people as a right or have paid family and medical leave. At a time when life expectancy in the United States is actually on the decline, we're going to ask what it means that our workers work some of the longest hours of any people in the world, while millions of jobs in this country provide zero vacation time. What does it mean that in a highly competitive global economy, we've got hundreds of thousands of bright young kids who cannot afford to go to college, and millions of others who are struggling with outrageous levels of student debt? But tonight's discussion is not just an analysis of our problems. We're going to talk about solutions, about where we go from here, and how we create an economic and political system which represents the needs of all Americans and not just a handful of wealthy campaign contributors. I am very pleased now to introduce the three panelists who will be with us throughout the evening. Elizabeth Warren is a senator from Massachusetts.
Woohoo!
And she is not only one of the outstanding members of the Senate, but she was, before coming to the Senate, a leading expert in this country on personal bankruptcy and the author of several books on the struggles of the American middle class, including a book entitled The Two-Income Trap. We have with us also Michael Moore. Michael is one of the outstanding documentary filmmakers in our country. He is an Academy Award winner for his film Bowling for Columbine, and has also produced such important documentaries as Fahrenheit 9/11, Roger and Me, Capitalism, A Love Story, and Where to Invade Next. And we also have, as part of our panel, Professor Darrick Hamilton. Darrick teaches economic and urban policy at the New School in New York City. Both his academic work and activism is aimed at promoting greater economic, political, and social inclusion. His work examines inequality and identity, racism, and socioeconomic outcomes. And later in the evening, we're going to bring into our panel Katherine Coleman Flowers, an expert on poverty, Cindy Estrada, a vice president of the United Automobile Workers, and Gordon Lafer, a professor at the University of Oregon, whose most recent book is The 1% Solution. All right, let's get going. Elizabeth, what's going on in America?
Okay. So I want to start this where picking up where Bernie left off, and that is, look at all the data right now about inequality in America, inequality in wealth, inequality in income. But I want to reframe this a little bit. I see this as inequality and opportunity, and that is one of the most corrosive parts about what's happening and what's gone wrong over a generation. And I look at this very, very personally. I'm somebody who grew up in a paycheck-to-paycheck family. We had our ups, we had our downs. My daddy ended up as a janitor. My mom ended up working a minimum wage job at Sears. I wanted to be a public school teacher, and that meant you had to get a college degree. And I had a lot of bumps along the way, but the bottom line was I got a chance to graduate from college because of a commuter college that cost $50 a semester. I grew up in America a generation ago where a kid who was willing to work hard could basically get an advanced education on a part-time waitressing job instead of having to take on debt to do it. Now, that doesn't happen by magic. It happens because of decisions that we make together, that we make in government to invest in educating our children. And I think the problem we have right now in America, every time I listen to these numbers, I think about them in terms of all of the kids who've been cut out of the game before they were 5 years old, all the kids who were cut out of the game before they were 15 years old, all the folks who were cut out of the game before they were 25, all the people who had just one slim little chance to make it through, and if they veered off that path at all, that they lost it entirely. So for me, what this generational shift is about is a shift in this fundamental question about who this government works for and who it creates opportunity for. And what I see so deeply wrong about these numbers is they reflect an America that works. God, it works for a thinner and thinner and thinner slice at the top. And that means leaving behind more kids and more kids and more kids. And someday we stay after that. We don't have the same America anymore. And that's what gets me in this fight, and that's what brings me to this panel. So that's it for me.
Thank you.
Good.
Michael, you've been all over the country and all over the world. What's your sense of what's been going on in America in the last 40 years or so?
There was a statistic I read recently that said on any given night in America, nearly 60% of our fellow Americans, if a loved one passed away tonight across the country, they don't have the money to be able to go to the funeral, to fly there. Nearly 60% of this country does not have available to them, access to them, in their pocket, in the bank, whatever, $400. Nearly 60% of our fellow Americans. I've said this since my first movie, Bernie, which, in these films I make, they're about a country that has an economic system that's unfair, it's unjust, and it's not democratic. You cannot call this a democracy if the democracy means we just get to go vote. But with the economy, if we have no say in this, then it's not a true democracy. And you mentioned the three men, the three richest men that have more than the bottom 50%. Those three men are not right-wingers. I don't think they're Republicans. Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Jeff Bezos. These are people that sort of tread water over on our side of the political fence. The question that I hope to talk about tonight a little bit, and maybe when we get to the solutions, is what we need to do to deal with the Democratic Party, because we need a party that's going to be there for the people, for the working people. My father first voted as a Democrat on the island of New Guinea in 1944. He was in the 1st Marine Division in World War II. And they came around with the ballots, and they said, you know, here, mark who you're for, and he voted for FDR. We're a long way from that place, and we need to get back to it. And we need to challenge people on our own side of the fence to stand up and do their job for the working people of this country.
Darrick, you write a lot about what is happening in America. What's your perception of what's going on?
Well, you and Senator Warren have correctly framed the problem in the sense that this is a choice. We don't have to have this economic despair, and I'm glad you both led with that. We live in a context where the way we deal with economic precarity is we discipline the poor. We try to manage their seemingly bad behavior, and another approach is we try to cajole the private sector with tax incentives to deal with our problems. That hasn't worked for the past 40 years.
No kidding.
We have a choice. We can do something else. We can instead empower people directly. So I'm glad that we have the opportunity not only to point out some of the problems, but talk about some of the solutions as well. And the key frame in which to address these solutions is to empower people. What is really pernicious is that the most vulnerable people, when trying to do something for themselves, they're the most exposed to predation, be it from the financial sector, be it from colleges and universities that might be incentivized by for-profit as opposed to a nonprofit motive. So that rhetoric has a harm on those that really try hard. We don't want that. We want a society where your efforts will truly be rewarded. I see the sign going up, we're going to move to another segment, but the list of despair is long and probably worth talking about at some point. It's not only income and wealth inequality, it's vulnerability to predation, vulnerability to natural disaster, vulnerability to stress and stigma of trying to overcome your obstacles that manifest in health inequities. And then I'd be remiss not to point out that these vulnerabilities are more pronounced for marginal groups. Race, gender, disability status, formerly incarcerated, they face obstacles that the general population doesn't. So I'm going to stop there, but hopefully we'll talk more throughout the day.
We will.
Yeah.
I think we have a video now.
People like to think of people in poverty because they don't want to do nothing but just buy soda pop and sit around and have kids, or people want to do stamps and on cash assistance or lazy. I've been on and off cash assistance quite a few times. On and off, on and off, on and off, on and off. The stigma, it's like it's almost a headband written across your forehead. Don't look down at me. Don't shame me. Try to understand me. Try to understand what it's like. I know what it's like to have went to bed without eating to make sure my kids eat. I know what it's like to have to call around and almost beg people for help. Being homeless twice. It's difficult. It's hard.
My name is Sabrina Schrader, and I'm from a holler in West Virginia called Twin Branch, where we had a good neighborhood and community. Twin Branch is in McDowell County. It's one of the poorest counties and one of the poorest states of the country. Because of inadequate health care, lack of transportation, and lack of resources, I was born into a family that was afflicted by domestic violence, child abuse. These circumstances do not cause poverty. They are caused by poverty. Due to conditions influenced by poverty, decreased chances for success are often swayed by drug abuse, poor health care, limited access to healthy food choices, unhealthy lifestyle habits such as smoking cigarettes, and little interstate access. Some say poverty is a death sentence. Frankly, I don't know how many times I've been given that death sentence.
This is where I come and I lay my head until the next morning. It humbles you because when I am blessed to get back on my feet, get everything going, I won't take anything for granted. My life is a routine. All I do is work. I mean, it's a struggle. Life is a struggle anyway, though. I work hard, go to work every day, and still got to come home to decide whether if I'm gonna be able to put food on the table, or if I'm gonna pay the light bill or the gas bill or pay rent. It's tough.
Okay.
Hello. Oh, sorry about that. Hello, everyone. I'm Kasparian, and I'm from the Young Turks, and I'm one of the digital media partners that's helping to draw attention and raise awareness about this incredibly important topic. And I want to thank all of the digital media partners who are doing that. And more importantly, I'd like to thank Senator Sanders for hosting such an incredibly important topic that gets overlooked or neglected in corporate media time and time again. You know, income inequality continues to be a great tragedy in a country such as America, where you have so much productivity, so much wealth, but so much of it is concentrated at the top 1%. And the reality is, another portion of that tragedy is how we have allowed the wealthiest individuals to essentially take hold of the narrative regarding all of us and stereotype us as individuals who expect entitlements, who expect to get things handed to us, when in reality, as Senator Warren brilliantly put, we want equality of opportunity. We want to have the same ability to accomplish the American dream as generations before us. And I would love to now introduce the panelist who is joining the discussion, Ms. Katherine Coleman Flowers. She's the founder of the Alabama Center for Rural Enterprise Community Development Corporation. Ms. Flowers has called attention to the lack of environmental and climate justice in poor rural communities, including exposing how some communities live surrounded by raw open sewage. Last year, she invited the UN Special Reporter on extreme poverty to Alabama, and he characterized what he saw as, quote, uncommon in the first world. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Katherine Coleman Flowers.
Katherine, thanks so much for being with us. You work amongst the poor in Alabama.
Yes, I do.
What are you seeing every day?
Well, I work primarily in rural communities. Alabama's Black Belt is one of the poorest areas in the United States, and the area is populated primarily by people of color. Alabama at one point, at the end of the international slave trade, Montgomery was the center of the domestic slave trade, and a lot of people that are in the Black Belt, their heritage goes back to those days, and I think that the structural poverty and the political structures that are in place reinforces the kind of poverty that exists in the area. What I've seen since I've returned to the area, because I grew up in Lowndes County, Alabama, I've seen raw sewage underneath mobile homes. I have seen people invest in on-site septic systems that they are told by the state health department to purchase, and it's running back into their homes. We have actually seen people, we did a study with Baylor's National School of Tropical Medicine where we found evidence of tropical parasites, including hookworm, in Lowndes County. And that is just an atrocity that at this particular time in our history, when we have these wealthy people, that we allow this kind of thing to take place here in the United States of America.
All right, so we're talking about environmental disasters among the poorest of the poor. Talk a little bit about the kids in rural Alabama, the kind of education they get, how many of them dropping out of school, how many of them are able to go to college, what kind of future do these young people have? I'm
going to use a family as an example that we went to see recently with Reverend William Barber, who leads the New Poor People's Campaign. And this family that we went to, the mother, single mother, 2 children, one age 9, one age 15. She's unable to buy clothes for her children. During those months, those few weeks when it was very, very cold, her power bill was so high that she had to choose between paying her mortgage and paying her power bill. And in places like Lowndes County, you don't get a chance to have a budget plan. If the bill is $200 or $300, you have to pay it on the 15th of the month. If you're a penny short, they're going to turn it off the next day. The same thing is true with the phones. So she doesn't have a car. One of her kids has sleep apnea, and she has to take the child to the doctor in Birmingham, and sometimes can't make the appointments because she doesn't have the transportation. And they're not pediatricians that are located in the county. You have to go to Montgomery, you have to go to other areas, the major areas where the population is more urban to get access to that type of treatment. In terms of the schools, we still have schools in the Black Belt with lagoons full of raw sewage that are right next to the schools. So we wonder why the students aren't doing well in the schools consistently or characterized as failing schools. It could be because there are illnesses that are there that American doctors don't survey for because they're not expected to be found in the United States.
Okay.
So I want to pick up on a point, because I've read your work, and you're really doing amazing work and trying to bring attention to this, but there's this catch-22 right in the middle of it, that you talk about how there's basically no sewage infrastructure. Think about that, in a place where people live in America, and as you point out, because of the way the land is, it's not like you can just dig a septic and you'll be okay. You just literally can't do that. This is why sewage backs up into people's houses, into their trailers. But business won't come to this area because there's no sewage infrastructure. And if there's no business, there's no tax base to build any sewage infrastructure. Do you see a pattern here about how this works? So you get these areas of poverty that just get locked in poverty. You see this some on Native American reservations, areas where right now a third of all people who are living on tribal lands have no access to the internet, none, zero. Who can run a business in the 21st century without it? Who can run a library without access to the internet? And so without it, nobody comes, nobody makes the investment. Mm-hmm. And if nobody comes and nobody makes the investment, then you create these circles of poverty that just wipe out opportunity for anyone. And this goes back to this fundamental question. This is where our federal government should be making investments. But investments in raising opportunity. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I agree with you, but I did economic development in Lowndes County.
Yeah.
And I remember going to talk to some people from the Economic Development Administration. And I asked them why, even when Hyundai came to the area, why were they not directing businesses to Lowndes County? And they said to me, well, the only reason to go to Lowndes County is to get to Montgomery or to Selma. Some of those same type of attitudes that existed prior to the 1960s, the structural racism that was reinforced by racial terror, is still in existence today.
Right. The water doesn't just get dirty. These are decisions that get made. And you don't have clean drinking water because of decisions about money that are made. We were talking backstage about Flint, and there are many Flints around this country, and it's not just that we have an environmental problem, but we have an economic problem where those people, in your case in Alabama, in my case in Flint, where decisions get made where they say, you know what, these people, they're not worth the investment, and they have no political power, and they don't buy candidates, and we don't have to do anything about it.
We just had an example of that recently. The study about the parasites was published in The Guardian, made international news September 5th of last year. A month later, it was announced that there was a town in Lowndes County was receiving money to expand its wastewater treatment. It went to the business community. It did not include the people that had tested positive for hookworm. So clearly, the people that could afford the wastewater infrastructure didn't get it. And it goes back to what we talked about before, the tax incentives that you mentioned earlier, that goes to the business community, but it doesn't translate on the ground to the people that are living in the community.
Yeah.
Darrick, jump in.
You referenced William Barber in the beginning of your narrative, and Senator Warren referenced why the private sector is not doing this. And it makes sense why they don't do it. It's not profitable for them. But William Barber has the right narrative. Economic justice should be a moral imperative. Why are we relying on the private sector to begin with? Somebody's dignity should not be based in the profit of a firm. That's just the bottom line. That's the truth.
Right on.
Let me ask you this, 'cause I think Michael raised this point, and that is the politics. How does it happen, not only in Alabama, do you think, but all over this country? We got 40 million people living in poverty, some in desperate poverty. We got people who can't afford childcare, they can't afford health care, they can't afford to send their kids to college. Alabama, anyone paying attention to those people?
You know, I think there are people that are paying attention, but I think that the same problem that you mentioned earlier is that if we look at these campaign finance statements and see who's funding these campaigns, then we'll understand why these politicians, in a lot of cases, are taking a blind eye to these kinds of issues. I mean, the example that I just raised of what happened in Lowndes County in October of last year was based on the fact that the people that had the power got they had failing septic systems too.
They got that.
But they have never been cited. In Alabama, you can be cited, paid up to $500 a day. You can be charged up to $500 a day if you are not in compliance, and you can also be arrested. None of those people have ever been arrested, and none of them have ever been fined. But they got the money. And they got the money based on, and the narrative that was put out there was based on the fact that this study was done and people are going to be able to get access to sewage. But if you didn't know the area and then go out there and actually investigate, you realize it did not include the residents. When you talk to the State Department of Public Health there, the narrative is that it's up to the homeowner. So that's unfair. And what has happened, what I believe, you know, when I see a lot of politicians going out into the community, they go to the other elected officials, they don't go out into the community. I think until they start going into the community, especially in the rural communities, and sitting down with mom and them and finding out what's really going on, we're never going to have any real change. Because the people that are making change are trying to make change from up here, and they haven't actually gone into the community to see how people are impacted by it.
Do you see in Alabama, maybe you want to generalize around the rest of the country, people beginning to stand up and really say enough is enough? That it is absurd that in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, people are living in such desperate poverty and are getting illnesses that don't even normally exist in our country. Are you seeing people beginning to stand up and fight back?
Yes, I am seeing people stand up. Actually, when Reverend Barber was there, I took him to a home, the same home that the UN Special Rapporteur went to. And at that time, you know, the identity of the person was hidden. He didn't want people to know. But after Reverend Barber talked to him and he showed up and he prayed with him, this man is willing to come to Washington and tell his story. You know, we have to, I think when they start seeing people show up that care, then they start feeling comfortable to come out and tell the story and fight back.
Katherine, can you tell how the United Nations, tell the story to the people who are watching this that don't know that the United Nations has had to go to Alabama and other places, and as they do go to the third world to cite this country? I mean, tell that story.
Yes, actually, working with a group out of New York, the Human Rights Law Clinic at Columbia University School of Law, we wrote a letter inviting the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty to come to Lowndes County, actually to come to Alabama, and he agreed to come. And when he went to Lowndes County, I told him we cannot take any, we're going to people's homes. We're not going to have a town hall meeting. We're going to go so you can actually see this. And he went there. And when he went there and people told their stories, he went inside their homes and he could see their suffering. And he went to a particular area where there was raw sewage all over the ground. And one of the reporters asked him, had he ever seen this before? And he said that this is uncommon in the first world. And for those of you that don't know, Lowndes County is between Selma and Montgomery. We have people to go there every year to celebrate the Selma to Montgomery March. And within 20 minutes of Selma, there are people living in these conditions that even the UN Special Rapporteur said is uncommon in the first world.
UN observers in Alabama.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
What I think is extraordinary, and in a sense what this meeting is about, is to tell people in Alabama, in Vermont, Massachusetts, all over this country, that they are not alone.
Yes.
That the reality is that tens and tens of millions of people tonight are struggling desperately, trying to take care of their kids, doing the best that they can, and they are worried to death about health care or education or environmental issues. And I think one of the hardest things that has to happen, it's not easy, is for ordinary people to stand up and say, this is my life, and I am in pain. This is the United States of America. This should not be happening.
That's right. I agree with that. And I would even go as far as to say, I mean, I was a teacher. I was a DC public school teacher. And I went back home. I taught
Teachers rock.
But I could not, my conscience would not allow me to not get involved. I don't live in that situation. But those are my people that live in that situation. And we're going to have to reach back, and if the people don't have the strength to do it, let's speak for them. But I think the more people that are speaking up, the more people are going to come forward. And I'm encouraging everybody, if the people in Alabama can't vote for themselves, vote for us. Make sure that we put people in place that will make sure that this type of income inequality does not continue to exist in this country. Because I'm concerned. I have a 2-year-old grandson. I'm concerned about his future. And I'm concerned whether or not he'll be able to do as well as me because of the structures that we have in place now.
The one issue that I would add, and maybe Michael can jump in on this one, is how often have you guys seen on television any discussion of poverty in America? You ever see it? No. Virtually not at all. 40 million people struggling. And what I would say to our friends in the corporate media, start paying attention to the reality of how many people in our country are struggling economically every single day. Let's talk about that issue.
Mike? I was just in West Virginia. You were in West Virginia recently. They had an amazing victory, the teacher strike in West Virginia. And this is a union. This union brought down the state apparatus at 75% women in this union. And they rose up, and Bernie, I didn't see hardly anything in the corporate media about this on any of the networks. Even some of the networks that we watch were, you know, Russia, turn the channel, Russia, 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 Russia. And I'm not saying that's not important.
You forgot about Stormy Daniels.
Yeah, okay. Stormy Daniels and Don Jr. and, you know, whoever else, all the shiny keys to distract us. That's what goes on in the media. All the other things that they talk about, and we should be seeing this. This we should see. We should know about the West Virginia teacher strike and the victory. What inspiration that would be around the country if you saw people in West Virginia do this. They haven't had a strike like this in forever, and they don't show this, Bernie, because what would happen if they did? What would happen?
In a so-called conservative red state, teachers stood up and fought back and won. Right.
Yes.
All right, Katherine, thank you very much for all that you're doing. Thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Katherine.
you for the opportunity.
We found out that they're gonna shoot the plant on Tuesday. We don't deserve what they're doing us, you know. It really hurts because, like I said, this is my second family, so it's really hard. It's really hard. I'm gonna miss all of them. I'm gonna miss them, and I don't think anybody on this planet deserves what they've done to us.
I've been a carpenter for 40 years. I've been on unemployment for the last 6 months. I've had a problem with my neck and my hand. I just got my last check last night. I knew we were going to be homeless. I knew it was going to happen. We lost our apartment. So I bought that van that we sleep in, took the seats out, and that's what we got the Safe Park program, and then that's what we've been doing.
Up this main street, there wasn't an empty building that didn't have a prosperous business in it. But little by little, they began to close one after the other. And now it's down to a ghost town, a ghost county, really.
When I was little, there was plenty of jobs. You got timbering and coal mines and coal fields gone. They done timbered everything out, so.
We're very pleased to have with us Cindy Estrada. Cindy is a vice president of one of the great unions in our country, the United Automobile Workers. Cindy, thanks so much for being here. And when we talk about the decline of the middle class, clearly we're talking about the loss of 50,000 factories in this country since 2001, of jobs being sent abroad to China, etc., of workers now working for much lower wages than they used to, and the decline of the trade union movement. You want to say a few words about those issues?
You know, I was reading a study the other day that 9 in 10 Americans believe that manufacturing is going to rebuild the middle class. And it makes sense that people think that because manufacturing jobs typically were associated with good jobs, but they were often union jobs. It wasn't because those jobs were given a really good wage because an employer decided to give it. You know, if you take my life, for example, you know, my father owned a bar in Detroit. Plants were by it. Union workers made high wages. They came into his bar. They spent money. They had disposable income. So not only did union workers do well, but the non-union workers that came in there, their wages were higher because of the bargaining power of workers. And because of that, 5 of us were able to go to college because workers had good jobs and businesses, like this video shows, had disposable incomes to spend. Their school systems were better. You know, but today people believe that because most manufacturing jobs today, you know, people think that you could, you know, raise a family like you used to be able to, that you could send your kids to good schools, that you could save for a retirement, but that's really not the case. Today, what's happening in this country with the decline in unionism is that you often have workers who are making, I just heard a figure, 600,000 workers in manufacturing are making $960 or less. 1.5 million manufacturing workers are making $11.90 or less. That means they're literally working for these wealthy corporations, working full-time, and then walking into a food stamp line. University of California, Berkeley did an amazing study that showed that 1/3 of manufacturing workers are in some form of subsidy. That means that $10.2 billion are going out to subsidize workers and to keep in mind that that's when companies are making billions in profits. It's not like these companies aren't doing well. They're doing well. Workers are subsidizing, us as taxpayers are subsidizing them. And then the other piece is it's so important not to have a discussion on inequality without talking about workers' power if they're able to sit across the table from their employer and bargain, collectively bargain. And wages are never going to go up, even with this amazing fight for 15, which is so, the workers who did that, it wasn't even on anyone's radar, so courageous. But even 15 isn't a living wage. It's not the wage that we grew up with. And so we have to have 15 in a union. Workers have to have a seat at the table because if it's left up to employers, they're always going to make a decision on their bottom line. It's about their bottom line. They're always going to send it to their shareholders and corporations. So I agree with what you said. We can't leave it up to the private sector. Workers have to get a seat at the table. And how do we build that trade union movement again when employers are spending $1 billion a year fighting and union busting, fighting workers as they try to organize? Because 60% of workers want a union. So you ask, why don't they get one? They don't get one because they're being fired. They're being told that their jobs will go to Mexico where they're competing with $3.95 an hour. In the auto industry, just to give you an example, as unions declined, the wages in the auto industry are declining 9 times faster than workers as a whole. And that's because as unions went down, wages went down, and we lost power. In politics, we lost power at the bargaining table.
Right.
Elizabeth?
Well, so I just want to pick up on your point about unions. Look, I think it's clear. Unions built America's middle class. It'll take unions to rebuild America's middle class. I just think that's a core, I believe, about workers. But I just want to look at some of the numbers around what's happened to America's middle class. You know, you watch America coming out of the Great Depression, kind of 1935 forward. You watch GDP doing this, and you watch America investing in the things that help create a middle class, investing in education, investing in infrastructure, investing in basic research, the things that help us go forward. Doing all of this based on progressive taxation. Those who have more pay a fair share and help pick up the ticket for that. And what happens 1935 to 1980? The 90% of America, everybody not in that top 10%, the 90% of America gets 70% of all new income growth in this country. Yeah, the rich did better. But everybody did better. Upper middle class, middle class, lower middle class, working poor, poor. Everybody was lifted because we were investing in opportunity. You watch that change at 1980. What happened in 1980? Ronald Reagan gets elected. We moved to trickle-down economics, cut taxes for those at the top, and start cutting back on investments in opportunity. So what happened?
And firing the air traffic control.
Fire the air, exactly. Break the unions. Yes. So union membership had been strong. Now what happens? One of the first moves of the Reagan administration is to break the union that actually helped support him and help him get elected. So what happens then? Here's the deal. GDP keeps going right on up. It's gone up in time one, 1935 to 1980, 1980 to 2017. Continues to go right on up. Where is the key difference when you stop making those investments in opportunity? The 90% of America, everybody not in that top 10%, how much of all that new income growth did they get? Answer, 0. 100% of it goes to the top 10%. So what happens in America? Wages just flatten out, and all those expenses, all those core expenses like housing and healthcare and getting your kids educated, transportation, childcare, those costs shoot through the roof, and the family gets caught in the squeeze. And so the family that a generation ago could make it on one income now can't make it on 2 incomes because those incomes have been so depressed relative to the rest of the expenses. Bernie knows because we've talked about this 100 times, but this was a big part of the research I did about families who go bankrupt. What was the narrative in America? People go bankrupt because they spent too much time at the mall. No, they spent too much time at the doctor's office. Our research was about medical bankruptcy, people who went broke because they lost their jobs, people who went broke because of a death or divorce in the family.
Michael, I'm sorry.
Hollows out America's middle class.
All right, Michael grew up in a city which maybe represents all of this, and that's Flint, Michigan. Mike, what have you observed over the years from Flint?
Well, back when I was growing up in Flint, Michigan, nearly every job was a union job. The person who bagged the groceries in the checkout line, there was a union for grocery baggers. And everybody did well. I mean, and you only needed one income. I'm so happy you're here from the UAW. My uncle Laverne, was in the Flint sit-down strike of 1936-37 that founded the UAW when they took over the factories in the middle of winter in Flint. And that's where the middle class really began with those strikes. And it allowed working people who didn't have an education to have a decent life, to be able to send the kids to college, to be able to do these things. And this has been ripped from people. And I've been waiting, Bernie, for the moment, and I think it is coming. And it's so crazy, the rich right now, the greed, the level of greed, that they think that people are not going to be at the gates. You can only build so many gated communities. When people are eventually going to say enough, you know, it's one thing if you've always been poor and you've never had the little things that they give the middle class to make us think that we're, you know, part of them. You know, in Flint, back in after these strikes in the 40s and 50s, the GM executive said, we need to build golf courses next to each of the factories. So there's a golf course by each of the factories in Flint, you know, within a mile or so, because they thought, give them some of the things that the rich have, and this will placate them, and they'll think that they're rich. And so all of our dads learned to play golf, you know, and because there was an 8-hour day back then, they got out of work at 3 o'clock, and they go play 9 holes of golf. And what happened, and you know this as being down there part of the union, that people stopped going to the union meetings. People started thinking that, you know, started voting for the rich man's candidates.
Right.
And the Macomb County effect, the Reagan Democrats, and undercut themselves in such a profound way. I want to just echo what you said here, and this is a critical part of this evening, Bernie, that organizing, joining a union, young people, you're going to have to do this. Yeah, I think we have seen young people on the rise, right? Lately, our young people are like on fire. They're on fire. And you're going to start in some lousy minimum wage job. What do you got to lose? Bring in the union cards. Contact one of the better unions that know how to do the organizing.
But we also have to help young people understand what a union is. It just means that you're taking a seat at the table and you're not going to let your employer make all the decisions. That's really
right.
What a union
That's really all. That's right. Everybody gets a seat at the table.
Darrick, did you want to jump in?
Well, let's even put some context on working poverty. 45% of homeless individuals work.
Say that again. I want everybody to hear that.
Actually, I'm slightly off. 44% of homeless individuals work.
Yeah.
But obviously don't earn enough to get themselves out of their situation so that they can have decent housing. 40% of workers are in contingent insecure jobs as defined by the General Accounting Office. 44% of workers earn below $15 an hour. So that's the context in which we're in. But I'm going to shift gears a little bit and say that if we really are talking about a middle class and economic security, we need to talk about wealth. And if we look at wealth, we know wealth is both the beginning and the end of economic insecurity or security. Wealth gives you, it's not just wealth as an outcome, it's what wealth can do for your life. We've talked about political power. If you got wealth, you can get political power. If you're faced with an expensive legal system, wealth will allow you to address that condition. If you have medical bills, wealth allows you to address your condition. If you want to send your child to an elite private school or university, those that have wealth can do so. We often think about wealth in terms of what the end is, but it's really the real power of wealth is what it can do for people. It gives you choice, it gives you freedom, it gives you agency. Now let's think about what wealth is in terms of numbers. Senator Sanders pointed out in the beginning of when we started that the top 10% of households, this might be slightly different than the statistic he gave for the top 1%, the top 10% of households have over 75% of the nation's wealth. The bottom 50% of households have about 1% of the nation's wealth. So however unequal we are in terms of wealth, race becomes a bigger predictor of somebody's wealth position than class itself. The typical black household has about 10 cents on the dollar as the typical white household, and that's including home equity. We talk about the middle class, there virtually has never been a substantial black middle class if we're defining it in terms of wealth. And as I pointed out to you before, wealth gives you agency. I'll give a couple of more statistics and I'll sum up. We know that if you are a head of household and you're black and you graduated from college, your family's wealth position is lower than that of a white family where the head dropped out of high school. So this feeds into the narrative of, can we simply work hard, study hard, and address inequality? The answer is no. Those things are important. Education is important in its own right. So when Senator Sanders proposes that we should have tuition-free public education, absolutely. But as an end unto itself, we exaggerate the economic returns to education, particularly for marginalized groups. And when we start getting into these narratives of a post-racial society, we're not there. Now, we can come up with comprehensive programs that include everybody, but we need to do it differently this way so that we make sure nobody is left behind, regardless of your race, gender, disability status, etc.
Okay, Elizabeth, and then I want Cindy to wind it up.
Okay, I just want to pick up though on the point about wealth and systemic racism, and just talk for 1 second about home ownership and what home ownership means in America. It is the principal way that the middle class built wealth. That is the #1 retirement plan in America, was pay off your house and live on your Social Security. The way that you hand down wealth to the next generation, if you're lucky enough to be able to hold on to it, is you get that house paid off, grandma and grandpa die in it, and then you can sell it, and the next generation will be wealthier. Families have been doing this for generations now in America. That is, white families have been doing this for generations. The impact of discrimination in housing, in racially restrictive covenants, and then in redlining, and then its inverse that led up to the crash of 2008, targeting communities of color for the lousiest mortgages out there, and then when things started to go south, foreclosing much more aggressively in those same communities of color.
After the crash.
That's right, after the crash. So it's been one after another after another. And the consequence of that is that you watch the divide. I'll just give you one part on the wealth divide. The black-white wealth divide. It's been there since we started measuring it in the 1940s. stays there. It's way too big. But the civil rights movement, 1965, when people get access to voting, when people get access to housing, when people get access to travel, when people get employment opportunities, 1965 to 1980, you watch the black-white wealth gap shrinks nearly 30%. And then what happens? Because of housing, 1980 to 2016, you watch the black-white wealth gap treble. So now in a city like Boston, the latest report, the Boston Globe did a series on this, is that the median white family in Boston has a wealth of about $247,000. The median black family in Boston has wealth of about $8.
I'm going to jump in really quick and say Kilolo Kijikasi, who's in the audience, funded this study that was done that you're citing with William Darrick and I. It points out that the median wealth household, so she should be applauded for providing the resources.
Cindy, I want to maybe conclude this segment by picking up on a point that Michael made, and that is, if we do not have a strong trade union movement in this country, if millions of working people, young people, people of color, are not coming together to engage in collective bargaining, to demand a fair shake on the job, the future of the middle class is not strong. How do we grow, taking on, as you indicated, all of those folks who are trying to destroy unions, making it harder and harder for workers to join unions? How do we go forward and rebuild the trade union movement in America?
You know, one is I think we're doing it. I think that workers are starting to see isn't just the service sector. It's not, McDonald's and Walmart workers. It is all workers that are working full-time, making poverty wages, walking into a food stamp line, and then being vilified for doing that while they make corporations really wealthy. So I think that we have to work together to make sure that we fight against these anti-union labor, all the appointments that are happening in the administration right now. But I really believe that workers are starting to stand up. In West Virginia, they stood up. Working people are going to start standing up because they're tired of making this poverty wage. And I don't believe that we can solve income inequality. People were able to afford houses because they had a middle-class job, because they didn't leave it up to the employer. They bargained for those rights. And I think we also, with all due respect, I love the senators, but a strong union movement, also to Michael's point, can hold politicians accountable and could have, not you two, because you both do but it's labor, it's working people that are responsible for fighting for Social Security, fighting for Medicare. And do working people make mistakes? Yes. Unions are made up of people. But I will take standing and sitting across the table from workers, or sitting on the same side of the table of workers, and then having the employers make the decisions, because it's always going to be their bottom line. And right now they're showing us. General Motors is importing 800,000 vehicles in from out of the country. Why? Because they can have workers in Mexico be paid $3.95 an hour versus the $30 an hour that workers are being paid in a union shop. So I think there has to be policy change, but we have to get workers that seat at the table and fight on their behalf every time we see someone who comes in and tries to bust a union or pass legislation that's anti-worker.
Okay. On that note, let's build the trade union movement in America. I'm going to end this segment. Thank you.
Thank you.
These are the three wealthiest people in America. These three men own more wealth than the bottom half of all American society. These are some of the 13 million children living in poverty in the United States, a country with more childhood poverty than almost any major country on earth. This is the Walton family of Walmart, who together have over $133 billion in wealth. This is a Walmart worker and her daughter. She makes $11 an hour and struggles to pay her bills, put a roof over her head, and put food on the table. This is Jamie Dimon. head of the largest bank in the United States. The 4 largest banks in America control more money than half of our entire country's economy. This is a family that lost their home as a result of Wall Street's greed. This is Jeff Immelt, the former head of General Electric, who received a $211 million retirement package after he left GE. This is a worker who lost his job when GE moved the factory he worked in to Mexico, where they searched for cheap labor. This is the chairman of Mylan, Robert Corey. He made $98 million in 2016. This is a patient who can't afford an EpiPen because Mylan raised the price of that life-saving product by 400%. How has it happened that over the last 40 years, the middle class of our country has been decimated while those at the top have done phenomenally well? All right. Wow. And to answer that question is Gordon Lafer, as a professor at the University of Oregon, who has written a lot about wealth and power in the United States. Gordon, what's going on?
You know, as a political scientist, I'm asked sometimes, how does it happen that in democracy laws get passed that go against the interests of the majority? And to answer that question, we really have to look behind the politicians and behind the parties to see what is the real power that is writing our laws. And that's not just the Koch brothers, but it's a handful of the biggest and most powerful political actors in America, which is the big corporate lobbies. The biggest lobby in the country is the Chamber of Commerce, which already, before Citizens United, the political budget of the Chamber of Commerce was bigger than either the National Republican or Democratic parties. Since the Supreme Court said corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money on politics, corporate political spending is up 600%. And what they're doing with that money is not just picking who sits in office, but actually writing our laws. My research recently focused mostly on the states, because until recently the federal government was deadlocked and the corporations focused on the states. The biggest vehicle through which corporate political activity happens in the states is called the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. You can find out about it, if nobody has to trust me, at a website called alecexposed.org. But this is how it works. ALEC is a collection of several hundred of the largest corporations in America and in the world. Over the last decade, it's included Facebook and Amazon and Google. This is a partial list of companies involved in ALEC: Ford and GM, Coke and Pepsi, Walmart, Home Depot, the insurance companies, the drug companies. Here's how they do it. About a quarter of all state legislators in the country are members of ALEC. They pay $50 a year in dues. The rest of the expense is paid by these corporations. They meet several times a year in committees that are made up half of elected legislators and half of corporate lobbyists, and they write bills together that are then introduced in cookie-cutter fashion in states throughout the country and now in the Congress of the United States. And then the same corporations that write the laws fund those politicians' campaigns, run their own advertisements, and hire so-called experts to promote their policies. They estimate that they introduce 1,000 bills a year and get 200 a year passed into law in the states. And to give you just one example of what are they doing with all this power, you know, the federal minimum wage does not keep pace with inflation because of the power of the corporate lobbies. It's now below what it was in 1968, and right now, tonight, 1 out of every 4 people in America is working for less than what the minimum wage was worth in 1968. In inflation-adjusted terms, working for less than minimum wage. All told, that's $100 billion a year that is taken out of the pockets of the people who do the work and put into the pockets of shareholders and investors just by political power. That's not something that anybody would vote for, not Republicans nor Democrats. That's happening because they have the power to control who's in office and to write the laws.
Gordon, what Elizabeth and I can tell you, dealing with this stuff every single day, is the insanity of a situation where the people want one thing and what we are dealing with in the U.S. Senate and the House is something completely different.
Right.
Poll after poll says the American people believe we should raise the minimum wage to a living wage. Elizabeth, not one discussion. Not one word. Poll after poll says the American people want common sense gun safety legislation. And what we got instead of that legislation, and Elizabeth was very involved in that, is the deregulation of some of the largest banks in America.
Right.
All right? So I want to ask you a question, because this is terribly important. You know, Elizabeth and I and other politicians go out into the real world, we talk to real people, and people tell us one thing, and we come here, we find we're living on another planet. All right? Describe for our audience how it happens that not only here in the Congress now, but in state after state, the needs of working people are ignored, the needs of the wealthy and powerful are addressed.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to say that it's not a partisan issue. As you said, a majority of both Republicans and Democrats support a higher minimum wage, support a right to paid sick leave, think that Citizens United should be overturned, and a bunch of other things. And the corporate lobbies are not cheerleaders for the Republican Party. They want more money and power for themselves, and they're not hesitant about going after pro-working people Republicans. In Michigan, when Right to Work, which is a law that's designed to kill unions in the private sector, was passed, the Senate Majority Leader, who was a Republican, was opposed to it. And he was taken in a back room with big money donors who essentially said, do what we say, or this will be your last term in office, because we'll pull our money from you and we'll fund a primary opponent. I think we just saw that in the Congress with the tax cut. Nobody was for the tax cut. Trump voters were not for the tax cut. The Republicans said, we're told by our donors, this is the one make or break thing we have to do, or we won't be back here because they'll fund an opponent to us in the primary.
They said it openly. And that wasn't the end. I mean, think about that. They actually openly got quoted saying, we have to deliver on tax cuts for the donors, or they won't be back again. You know, we need to call this out for what it is. It is corruption, plain and simple. And what I find so powerful about your point is that this is an organized effort just simply to take over our government at the federal level, take over our government at the state level, and make the government work better and better for a thinner and thinner rich slice in America. And it's the campaign contributions. We talk about those, but it's so much more than that. It's the fact that they can hire armies of lobbyists. You know, I still remember back following the financial crash when you would have expected that the banks, having just gotten bailed out by the American taxpayers, would just be a little bit chagrined, just a little embarrassed to show up in the halls. No. They spent $1 million a day lobbying against basic financial reforms, lobbying against the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And I still remember, because this is when I was still a teacher, I'd come down to Washington to try to fight for the consumer agency, and literally, the lobbyists would come by in such big herds of people in hand-tailored suits and, you know, handmade loafers that you kind of had to lean back against the hallway and let it go down the hallway. It matters. There is this huge lobbying apparatus on the side of corporations, on the side of money, on the side of giant banks. Who's there for the folks who get cheated?
All right, let me ask, Michael, you raised an issue, and Gordon did as well. This ain't just the Republicans.
That's right.
All right. How does it happen that big money can dominate both political parties? What do we do about that?
I was at the Oscars a couple years ago, and I get tapped on the shoulder, and it's the CEO of Goldman Sachs. And he says to me, why are you attacking us? We're Democrats. He says to me, we're Democrats. I said, I know that. I know that you are the largest single private contributor to President Obama. Thank you for that, by the way. But, you know, you were expecting something, and he was like appalled at this. If you look at the money that goes to support Democratic candidates, and we were talking with Katherine backstage in Alabama, how they come in with the money, and whether the representatives are Democrats or Republicans, they go for the money. And it's one of the hardest things that we have, those of us working on these issues, that how do you fight the money? And the only way you fight it is you have to have the votes and the people, because
what I said to the chairman of Goldman Sachs was, I said, you know, it's really got to bother you that with all the money you and your Wall Street friends have, when you go in that voting booth and you pull that curtain, you only have one vote. Each of you just have one vote. And you know there's more of us than there are of you. That's got to frighten you every single night. You know the only way out of this is with the bucks that you put into this system to make it corrupt, to make it sick. And sooner or later, the people aren't going to take it anymore. And that'll be the end of it. Have a good time at the Oscars.
And did he make a contribution to your film?
He did not make a, in fact, when I went to make my next film, because Goldman Sachs is an investor of that studio, they said, we're sorry, we can't do this because of the Goldman Sachs people on the board. Wow. And I was not able to make that next film. I went someplace else. But no, they affect me, they affect you, they affect all of us. They're everywhere, and they are those creepy, what's the name of that movie with not the Battlestar, what's the, you know, the movie with the creepy, on the planet, and then, you know, with the sand, they come out of the sand. That we're in the middle of it right now.
Darrick, money in politics, what's going on?
I mean,
Michael is still creeping around here. But.
Ask me something about economics, not creepy crawlers. But no, you know, some of the rhetoric we've already even heard so far, Citizens United, right to work. My colleague William Darity says an authentic right to work would be a federal job guarantee. They're winning the... The issues with regards to politics is beyond just voting, and that's clearly evident with the ways in which corporatists can lobby and control things. So I think we need to be even more sophisticated than just talking about voting. Voting is obviously essential and important, but beyond voting, we need social movements. And Senator Sanders has talked a lot about this, building a social movement. He's used the word political revolution, and there are examples of this. Color or Change, for example, is an organization that fought back against ALEC. I think in the context of the Trayvon Martin case was an example with the laws in Florida. I can't remember the exact legislation, but they forced some corporations to abandon ALEC or risk boycott. So we have other examples. Parkland, the young people in Parkland right now, their efforts in trying to organize and mobilize. Black Lives Matter. They've done a whole lot to bring attention to Occupy Wall Street. I mean, there are plenty other ones. I'm grateful for the young people that have the courage to get out there and advocate for my rights in a way that I didn't do in my generation. So oftentimes we denigrate young people. They're doing things that my generation didn't do. The previous generation before mine actually did it, and I give props to them as well with civil rights and all types of political activism, but these young people are spot on, and I hope they save us.
And also, and Bernie, can I just, also the Me Too and the Time's Up movement, the uprising of women right now as part of this. And you think about this statistic, nearly 70% of this country now is either between the ages of 18 and 35, people of color, or women, or a combination of the three. That's between 2/3 and 70% of the entire country right now. That's the way, and this is the way we're going to fight this oligarchy. This is the way we're going to do this because we are the power here. And we were talking earlier about the people who don't vote. The largest political party in America right now is the non-voters party. 100 million plus strong. 66 million voted for Hillary, 63 million for Trump, 100 million. And they are, Bernie, you've said this many times, they're not voting because they're apathetic or they're lazy or they're stupid. It's actually an act of civil disobedience to them, that they refuse to participate in this. And what I do, and if any of you are watching this at home, and you haven't voted because you feel the system has given up on you, and that there's just not worth it anymore, first of all, I embrace you. I honor you for your courage because you love this country, and you've decided that as much as I love this country, I refuse to participate in this rigged system where it's bought and paid for by ALEC and all these other corporations. But what we have to do now, because in November, in order to stop the madness that's going on right now, that's only going to, don't go and tell people, you got to vote. You better vote. Well, they're not going to vote unless we give them a reason to vote, and unless we put up candidates who they're going to want to vote for. Not the same old, same old. Women, people of color, young people run, veterans. That's how we'll do it.
All right, Gordon, I want to give it back to you.
Thank you. You know, I think for the corporate lobbies, the big problem for them is that although they have tremendous amount of power, the majority of people don't agree with their platform on an issue by issue basis.
There is a problem. Yeah, that's a problem. Should be in a democracy.
So this is the big problem for them, is how do they pursue an agenda that makes the economy yet more unequal, that makes life yet harder for the majority of people, and not provoke a backlash?
A marketing challenge.
Partly they do it by voter suppression, by making it impossible for millions of people to vote. Partly they do it by making it illegal for cities and counties to vote for a higher minimum wage or sick leave. But I think they're also trying to get all of us to lower our expectations of what we think we have a right to demand, either of the government as citizens or of our job as workers. So if I come to feel like my daughter's in a class with 35 kids, but at least it's not 40. I don't have comprehensive health insurance, I only have catastrophic, but so far I'm not sick. I don't have any paid vacation, but I'll have time off between this job and the next. The more we ratchet down what we think we have a right to demand, it normalizes the experience of downward mobility and makes things safe for them. And that's why I think the demand for free healthcare, the demand for free higher education is so important, because it raises our sights back up and reminds people of what we have a right to demand.
Exactly. And the point, I've said it 100 times, it's not good enough to rant and rave against Trump's outrageous statements every other day. We've got to do more. We've got to have a vision for this country as to where we are going to go.
That's right.
And the vision that all of us are talking about, I know we get criticized, we're too radical, we're too extreme. You know what? All of the stuff that we're talking about exists in other countries around the world.
Right.
All right? I think you can watch television till the cows come home. We say that in Vermont. I don't know if other people say it. And you will not know that the United States is the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people. We have thousands of kids going to Germany for higher education. Why? Because they get it free in Germany. You talk to the German ambassador, they get 30, 40 days of paid vacation every single year. The average American wouldn't even believe you when we got tens of millions of people who take no vacation at all. So our job is to have a vision as to where we can go and get candidates who are prepared to stand up and fight for that vision.
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
Good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And by the way, Bernie, for the young people who are watching this at home, young people, what he just said, you literally can move to Germany, Finland. There's a number of countries that feel so bad for us. They have structured enough classes in English. You can move to Germany and go to school, 4 years of college for free. I'm not making this up. Check this out. It's just, this is so sad, Bernie, that we have to even mention this to our own people who should be able to do that here in this country.
I mean, it is more than sad. And I say this as someone whose dad came to this country at the age of 17 without a nickel in his pocket and was the proudest American that ever existed. You know, he loved the country. But there is something very wrong when, as Michael says, young people have got to go to Germany in order to get a higher education. There's something wrong when people have got to go across the Canadian border to get affordable prescription drugs. There's something wrong when in the greatest nation in the history of the world, the most wealthy nation, our infrastructure is collapsing, and we've got 40 million people living in poverty. So I want to throw it to Elizabeth and to Michael and to Darrick kind of to sum up, and that is, where do we go from here? How do we bring millions of people, many of whom, as Michael indicated, have given up? How do we re-energize those people? How do we get them to stand up for the things that every American is entitled to? How do we successfully take on the incredible greed of this 1% that wants it all and is prepared to step on everybody in their way? So, Elizabeth, let me throw it to you, and we'll just
Okay,
go around.
so let me start with one, and that is you got to have something to get out there and fight for. We really want to boost productivity in this country. We want to create more opportunity. How about if we have childcare available at a lower cost to everyone?
Right there.
And let me just, on this one, I start there because it speaks to just kind of who we are and what we value in this country. We have a whole lot of folks who get cut out of opportunities in education, cut out of opportunities in work because they have children and they're struggling to try to make the pieces fit together. That was true 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago, when women were first entering the workforce in big numbers. We watched productivity go up in this country. This country got richer because more parents were able to go to work. But the problem was they couldn't manage the cost of childcare. Childcare in this country, I mentioned it earlier, has gone up. The cost, the adjusted cost, housing has gone up, what is it, 50%, 80%, healthcare has gone up, but the cost of childcare is up by 1,000%. Families just can't do this. So I see this as somebody who was a young mother herself, who struggled with childcare, who almost gave up on school, who almost gave up on my first big job because I couldn't get childcare. I see this as just one of those things to say, get out and fight for it. This is a decision we can make.
And let me interrupt you and ask you this, Elizabeth. Sounds like a really radical idea.
I know.
All right. We had the German ambassador come into Burlington, Vermont. Somebody asked him about childcare. As I understand it, every child in Germany, 1 year or older, free childcare.
Yeah.
Not a radical idea, but something absolutely imperative and necessary. All right, let me go to Michael. Mike, final parting words here.
First of all, thank you, Bernie, for sponsoring this town hall. You are a national treasure. And thank you, Bernie and Senator Warren, for being my co-stars in Capitalism: A Love Story.
Hey, I was an early, remember, I was in Sicko.
You were in Sicko, that's right. That's right. When somebody told me that there was this professor at Harvard, and somebody had told Kubrick that there was a professor at Harvard, and his name was Henry Kissinger. He based Dr. Strangelove on him. All those years later, we found you at Harvard, and I think hopefully did better.
I hope so.
But I want to say this in closing, and what I think we can do. 15 years ago tonight, our country invaded Iraq. 15 years ago tonight, we invaded a country that did not bring down the World Trade Center. A country that had not killed any Americans. We're sitting in the building that approved this months before. 29 Democratic U.S. senators voted to give President Bush war powers to invade Iraq 15 years ago tonight. This is why I started tonight talking about this, and I want to close by saying it's so important that we hold the people that say that they're for the people, hold their feet to the fire. And if they're not going to do the job we send them here to do, well, let's get somebody else. It's so critical. And I am optimistic. I have a thread of optimism still in me. I believe that we will, in November, see a tsunami of people coming to the polls. And after that, I hope that you, both of you, and the other senators do their job. We have a Democrat running in my district in Michigan right now to unseat the Republican. And I went to hear him speak, and the first words out of his mouth were, after he said that he was for single-payer health care and all these other good things, and he was an Iraq veteran, he said, I want you to know that in this election, you are not electing a member to the House of Representatives. You are electing the jury for the impeachment of Donald J. Trump. Never forget that over these next few months. So with that in mind, it's an imperative of all of us, but I want to make this very clear, and it's something that Bernie said earlier, the greater vision that we have to lead with here. If we just get rid of Trump, and we just go back to the day before Trump, how were things then? Yeah. Senator Warren and Senator Sanders, with our health care, with our job situation, with poverty. I don't want to go back to that day. Right. We've got to move forward, and we have to provide that vision and that leadership to make that happen. I want to repeat for the third time Darrick's line, because it's so important that people understand this. 44% of all homeless people work, have a job. The next time that you see a homeless person, don't make an assumption. In fact, the next time you see a worker, don't make the assumption that they have a roof over their heads. When you hear about the working class put in Trump, and they talk about it as what they mean is the white working class. Women are still paid 30 cents less on the dollar than men. Women are the working class of America. African Americans and Hispanic people are the working class of America. This is the majority of this country. With this majority, we can make change happen, but it's only going to happen if each of us does it, each of you watching at home, in your communities. When I was in West Virginia last week, a group of people are working there. They're going to their county Democratic meetings. And if the Democrats aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, they are in the process of taking over their local Democratic parties. Do that. Go to your next Democratic Party meeting. Run people that you believe in. We can make this change happen. Don't think it's going to happen on its own. And God bless you, both of you, for being in this building and coming here every day. And we admire you both so much. Thank you so much. And let's hear it for them. And Bernie, just one quick thing. Is there any way I can have this United States Senate mug to take home?
Well, I'll speak to Mitch McConnell about it, but I think it'll be all right. Darrick?
So rule number one is never close after Michael Moore. Ultimately, we need a paradigm shift. As you heard today, the problems are more political than economic. We need to stop exploiting, extracting, and managing economic vulnerable people, but rather give them the resources so that they can be self-determining and achieve the goals that they define for themselves and be empowered. That's what we need to do in terms of a shift. In terms of policies, I'm going to give you a list, and then they're bold policies. The problems are bold, and I think the solutions need to be bold. So we have vast wealth inequality in our country. Why don't we endow every child at birth with a trust account so that when they become a young adult, they have some seed capital to purchase a home, to start a business, or have a debt-free college education?
Great idea.
People ask me, can we afford it? Certainly we can afford it. The baby bonds program would cost about $80 billion. That's about 1/5 or less than 1/5 of what we currently spend on asset promoting policies. The problem is not the dollar amount of that $500 billion asset subsidy, it's to whom it's distributed. That's right. The bottom 60% of earners get about 12% of that. The top 10% get about 60% of that allocation. So we can have everybody have asset security. We can talk about a federal job guarantee. Why don't we remove the threat of unemployment altogether? Why don't we eliminate working poverty altogether? Why don't we empower workers so that they're better able to bargain in their current jobs without that threat of being destitute from being unemployed? Why don't we professionalize care work? Elizabeth Warren talked about care work. Professionalize it. Give it the dignity of a wage as well as some benefits and as well as the quality that comes along with a government program that ensures everybody has quality care. We could federalize credit scores, for instance. Should we have something so determinant in people's lives left in the proprietary private sector that has different incentives? Postal banking, so that we ensure everybody has a bank account. Everybody has access to some finance without relying on a predatory payday lending or other forms of predation that might come about from people that are vulnerable, but in this context of economic and expense volatility, need some short-term cash to hold themselves over. Why don't we be proactive in detecting discrimination? Why doesn't the EEOC proactively go out and audit firms that receive federal dollars to see if they're discriminating? Why don't we eliminate tracking in grade school altogether? We talk about school integration. We have segregated schools. We have segregation within school. Why are all the black kids in the low track schools and the white kids are in the high track schools? It's certainly not ability. We can integrate these classes and provide everybody with quality access to schooling. I know I'm running out of time. Single payer health insurance is obvious. Stop mass incarceration. And I'm going to end on something. We know we have a divided economy with the resources unevenly distributed. We also know that when we think about race, it becomes apartheid-like. So if we really want to address our race problem, I'm going to say something bold, but America needs to come to reckoning with this. We can redress inequality, and we have lots of programs to do so. But if we really want to address the race problem, there needs to be acknowledgement to go along with that redress. Senator Warren talked about ways in which, even beyond slavery, that we positioned one group of people better off to grow their assets where other people were denied access to that. So to really get beyond our race problem, when we're ready as a nation to come together, we need to come to grips with reparations.
Thank you. We have gone a little bit long, but I think it was worth it.
There we go.
And I want to thank these three great panelists. And I think it is fair to say that in the last hour and a half or so, we have discussed more issues of vital importance to the American people than has ever been seen on a television screen in the history of this country. And I want to end on an optimistic note because I share the optimism of all of the panelists here. And that is, yes, these are difficult and unprecedented times in the history of our country, no question about that. But what we are seeing all over this country is people standing up and fighting back. Yes. We're seeing people, young people, people of color, women, running for office for the first time and winning. We're seeing voter turnout going up, not down. So our job is to have a vision, is to rally the American people to reclaim our democracy and to create a government, not a radical idea, a government that works for us and not the 1% and wealthy campaign contributors. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Bernie.
Please stand up.